The purpose of the PET exam is to show that candidates can use everyday basic English in a range of everyday situations and ask for help or clarification in difficult situations. It's at the B1 level according to the Common European Framework, which means basically that they can use everyday English in a range of predictable situations. In the speaking exam, students will be assessed on various things. Their pronunciation, how clearly and easily they speak in English, how easy they are to understand. Their discourse management, which is how they organise what they say, how they put their sentences together. Their grammar and vocabulary, how well they use grammar and the range of vocabulary that they use. And also their interactive communication, how well they interact with other people, including the examiner or the other candidates. Part 1 is very much an introductory stage where the candidates have to answer basic questions about themselves, including how to spell their name, but also questions about familiar topics like their likes and dislikes, their daily routine, things like that. In part 1, the examiner is looking to see if the candidate can talk with ease about their likes and dislikes, their preferences, their daily routines, their weekly routines, things like that, what they often do. And see if they can use a range of vocabulary, use tenses accurately, and whether they're easy enough to understand. If students want to prepare for part 1, it's important to have practiced answering common, everyday, familiar questions. Obviously, they can do this in class. It's important to just be able to understand them easily and respond to them naturally without having to think and process too much. In part 2 of the speaking test, the candidates will talk together rather than to the examiner. They'll be given some material to discuss with pictures and prompts, and they'll be expected to show that they can discuss and make suggestions or recommendations and come to some agreement about what to do in a particular situation. In part 2, interactive communication is a particularly important area because this is where the candidates are talking together. So this is the chance to show off that they can interact well with someone else in English, but also the other things that are assessed throughout the exam are being assessed: pronunciation, grammar and vocabulary. It's important to prepare for part 2 because it's a slightly artificial scenario, so it's important to practice in class going through the practice materials using this kind of prompted discussion and learning certain expressions that they can use naturally to ask for what do you think, do you agree, to talk to their partner, to interact or to respond to their partner. That's a good idea, yes, I agree, things like that. And remember that they don't have to rush towards a conclusion. Sometimes candidates rush too much towards the conclusion and could spend longer discussing the different alternatives. In part 3, each candidate will have to talk for around a minute about a colour picture that they'll be given one by one. First, one candidate will speak and a short question will be asked to the other candidate after they've finished, very brief question, and then they'll swap roles. So the other candidate will speak about the picture for around a minute. And it's just, in this, they're trying to show that they can talk for a longer period and describe and say what they can see in a picture. In part 3, the examiner is looking to see if the candidate has a command of basic vocabulary that they see, the ability sometimes to paraphrase if they don't know the meaning of a word, they don't know how to say a word, that they can paraphrase, and also basic command of grammar, that they can organise their tenses correctly, maybe to talk about a picture. They're not expected to be 100% accurate, but they'll be able to speak so that you can understand what they're saying, and it's effective communication. In part 3, students can prepare by practicing in class, talking about pictures, being able to talk for up to a minute about something, and use common everyday vocabulary for nouns, verbs, what people are doing, what they can see. That's the important thing there, but also perhaps to be able to paraphrase if they don't know how to say something, that they've got a strategy for talking about it, so that they feel confident and familiar with that type of activity, and to try and practice describing the picture in a way that they sort of imagine someone else can't see it, so that they're giving a full description. In part 4, the candidates will talk a little bit more together about the kind of subject they've been talking about when they were describing the pictures in part 3. So, for example, if the pictures in part 3 showed people cooking or eating, then part 4 discussion might be something to do with food. And they'll be expected to be able to talk about their likes, dislikes or preferences related to food. In part 4, the examiner is looking to see if they can talk about likes and dislikes, preferences and everyday activities, but also that they can interact with each other and ask each other questions and respond to each other, and repair the discussion if it breaks down. If one person stops talking, the other can push the other one to speak, things like that. To prepare students for part 4, it's important to do lots of discussion practice in class, speaking in English, discussing things, asking another person their views or what they like, what they dislike, and to have a good command or a good basic command of language to talk about likes, dislikes, preferences, things like that, so that they feel confident and that they can engage in interaction and say things like, what about you, me too, things that show that they're listening and communicating with another person. PET is an exam that the name PET stands for Preliminary English Test. It's an exam that tests whether students have reached what's called the B1 level, according to the Common European Framework. The B1 level means that they can use English and ask questions and deal with things in English in a range of everyday situations that are fairly predictable. PET and PET for Schools are basically the same exam, the same tasks, the same timing, the same way of assessing it. The only difference is that the content and the topics in PET for Schools are aimed at a slightly younger type of candidate, so their interests and experience may be slightly different. The PET exam is aimed at students above the age of 15. PET for Schools is for 11 to 14-year-olds really in general. And so the PET candidates tend to be fairly young, but someone of any age could take it. If a student gains the PET certificate, they're showing that they've got an internationally recognised certificate, which proves that they can speak English to a communicative standard in a range of everyday, predictable situations. As far as what to cover in class is concerned, teachers are advised to look at the handbook provided for the exam, and they'll see the language specification section in there, which deals with all the different functions and topics that could be necessary for taking the exam. As far as difficulty in the speaking exam, some students find talking on their own more difficult than talking to someone else. So speaking about the picture can be one that people find a bit challenging, but it really does depend on the person, and everyone has their section that they find easier or more difficult. Candidates normally take the speaking test at an officially recognised centre, which could be a school or a college typically. Teachers don't normally accompany their students, although they can take them to the centre where the exam's taking place, but they certainly can't go into the room with them during the exam. Candidates do the exam in pairs or threes, so they can choose to be with a friend or someone that they've practiced with a lot. In some cases, if they were going to an exam centre and they were the only student, or there weren't many from their school, then they might get paired with someone that they didn't know, but it shouldn't be a problem. If one of your students is shy and doesn't like talking a lot, then it's important that they've practiced trying to talk more than they usually do, and that they feel confident and relaxed and comfortable with what they have to do in the exam. Beyond that, it's up to them to speak as much as they can and feel comfortable with, and tell them that they need to speak more if they're reluctant to. Normally, for a typical speaking test, there is a pair of candidates, 2 students, and an examiner who will ask the questions, and then there's another person who is called the assessor, who just watches the exam. They don't speak except to say hello and goodbye. At the end of a morning or afternoon or session, it's possible that candidates might have to do the test as a 3 rather than a 2. But that's only at the end of the morning or afternoon. If students aren't experienced with talking together very much, then it's important to practice this as much as possible in class, so that they feel comfortable and as if it's something normal to speak in English together with another person, especially if they're both from the same language background. It may feel unnatural at first to speak in English rather than their first language. So it's just a question of practice and familiarity. The exam is, the final mark for the exam is pass or pass with merit, which is the higher one, pass with merit. If a candidate didn't quite meet the pass standard, then they could get a certificate showing that they've reached A2 on the Common European Threshold level, which is lower than B1, which is the PET standard, or on the Common European Framework. If they didn't reach that standard of A2, then they would get a fail mark. Students will find out the results of the speaking test several weeks after the exam, not on the day of the test. All parts of the exam are assessed and will contribute to the overall marks. Some people find part 1 easier because it's about familiar questions, but it's still assessed. But the easier part comes earlier on in the exam to make students feel comfortable as early as possible.